think Daniel would be a great guy to give a Twitter account to, or maybe an X account, because, his response is reflective and prophetic. It's not reactive. Kind of speaks to what we've been trying to say all along, is that our engagement needs to be out of a deep and rich place, which God deposits within us, and not out of this kind of rapid fire reaction that our culture and particularly social media promotes within us. So let me go and think about this so that I can say something productive and something that has the hand of God on it. I think it's probably a lesson that we need to learn. Before you send the email, before you tweet, pray about it.
Greetings and welcome to this week's Calling a City to Life, a podcast by Queen's Park Baptist Church in Glasgow. We are joined by Jackie. Say good morning, Jackie.
Good morning, Jackie.
Good. See if we can make it 3 out of 3. Say good morning, Ian.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here, whatever time of day it is.
Yeah, it's becoming a running theme. It wasn't a trope I expected we'd develop, but we have, so there we go. And we're joined by a man who has just revealed, seeing as we're talking about Daniel today, that he is in fact a trained lion tamer. Brodie, we'll get to that story at some stage later on, but we'll just refer to you as Brodie the Lion Tamer while we're talking about Daniel today. So yeah, as trailed, we're talking about Daniel. So Ian, in 60 seconds or less, you preached this weekend. Give us a summary of what you spoke about.
Well, I didn't do it in 60 seconds or less on Sunday, as you probably noticed. But we're basically at the end of our series on Old Testament characters. In many ways, I think Daniel pulls a lot of that together. And I think what I was trying to say is that for the good news about God and what he's done for us to proliferate in our world, then we need to live as public witnesses. But it does appear to me that's increasingly difficult, or at least in our current social setting, we are somewhat nervous of doing that. And Daniel was also in a culture where he was faced by religious and political intimidation, but he was able to stand up for what he believed. And we're really looking at what enabled him to do that. And in good old sermon fashion, I had 3 things that I tried to say. The first thing was that he had a rhythm of personal spiritual life, so that his core strength came from that rootedness, that there were pivotal moments. That secondly, that he chose not to compromise, but to resist the pressure that was on him. And the third thing, that he had an awareness that God had strategically located him and given him opportunities to be used for his glory.
Excellent. Well, you started off the sermon by asking a rhetorical question of sorts about, as you've touched on there, about whether we're hesitant in speaking out about our faith and belief in public. You asked the question, are we wrong? Or were you wrong? Brodie, was Ian wrong?
Are we, yeah, I'm trying to think, what was the question there? Are we hesitant? I sometimes think we speak out about the wrong things. I think if we're going to speak out, then we need to be attentive to what God spoke out about. And I think there's a danger that we create more heat than light by getting embroiled in culture wars, when primarily I think God asks us to witness to who he is as the God who raises Jesus from the dead, and also on those justice issues. It seems that God's got an awful lot to say, particularly in the prophets, about how we treat the least in society. And yet as Christians, it's not that we don't speak out about that, but we get sidetracked into all kind of unfruitful cul-de-sacs, would be my thought when we do speak out. Interestingly, it's the age of anxiety. It struck me that, do you know what, probably every age is an age of anxiety to a lesser or greater degree. W.H. Auden won the Pulitzer Prize for writing a very long poem in the 1940s, reflecting on the 1930s, called The Age of Anxiety. So it's not just Ian's rabbi friend that's thinking about this, but this has been a theme of anxiousness that has been with us for some time.
Would it be fair to say that in recent years we have seen some of the most extraordinary examples of opinions being aired in ways that are unhelpful, or people speaking out about things in faith related in ways that are unhelpful culturally. Ian?
I mean, I think that goes across the board for lots of things, doesn't it? I mean, I think it's not just an age of anxiety, but it's an age of social media. And the algorithms that drive social media tend to underwrite and amplify those things that are much more reactive and reactionary. So I think there are just movements that accelerate those extremities in our society. And I mean, I guess part of Edwin Friedman, his kind of point of view is that our cultures are becoming more reactive and less thoughtful. And given that this book was written really before social media, I think that it is quite prescient as a perspective on a world, where we do react to things, and where I think he also calls it the seatbelt society, where our fear of harm, our fear of danger kind of paralyzes us from doing things. So he would contrast that with a sort of posture of adventure and faith, and would regard a lot of just kind of these general rules and guidance that are already there for our benefit, but have really become endemic in businesses, organizations, and churches and so on. All of these things begin to affect the culture of our minds, and we begin to think firstly about, or if you like, we kind of almost lead with where's the risk here rather than where's the opportunity. Now, I'm just kind of thinking of this out loud. I'm not sure if this is actually the case. It's just a little kind of niggle I've had in my head. I'd love to hear what people think about this. So send your messages into the podcast, make your comments. Are we becoming more hesitant because we fear maybe even formal consequences of speaking out? And I think I would just really concur with Brodie. I'm not talking here about, getting on your high horse. There it is, Jackie. There's a horse reference for you.
Thank you.
But not getting on our high horses and kind of banging the drum for some particular thing that we as Christians think is important. But actually, I think we need to learn how to articulate the good news about Jesus in our society in a way that's comprehensible, because I think people have really forgotten what that is. And I'm not sure that even as church, we lead with our core message. And I think the world gets distracted that we are somehow just out as moralizers or complainants in our society. So I think there is something about regaining, you could call it a confidence in the gospel, but also just a confidence in being able to articulate that message in our culture, which is what I think Daniel does in word and in deed so well.
I wonder whether kind of like the age of anxiety kind of thing and the failure of nerve is the symptom of something deeper rather than the cause itself. So if Ian's very taken with Friedman's age of anxiety, I'm quite taken with Andrew Root's analysis of ministry in a secular age, and he draws upon a Canadian philosopher called Charles Taylor, who wrote a great big hefty book that you could probably kill somebody with, called The Secular Age. And in that he kind of like outlines of there's three kind of like different kinds of secular, and the period that he would say that we're in just now is what he calls secular 3. And at the root of that is kind of like the air that we breathe, the water that we swim in, is a closed system in which God is not active. And I wonder whether actually our failure of nerve, our lack of confidence, actually comes from in our spaces out with a Sunday morning. We're not terribly confident that God is with us. And one of the things that we need to recover, I think, is that sense is God is with me. In the broad kind of like mysteriousness of God, for want of a better phrase. So God is with me, and that doesn't mean that I've got all the answers for why A, B, C is happening. But I know that God is with me and that God is active and God is doing things here. And therefore I can witness to and speak to that. So I think sometimes our failure of nerve is we're not quite sure whether God will stay the lions and stop them from eating us, but they will be eaten.
There are too many good points here, and I want to go in too many different directions, and that's not even asking Richard, who probably has his own directions.
Oh, I'm busy scribbling.
Yeah, I'm scribbling too. Ian, going back to what you were saying, if just to get some clarity, you are not saying that you are trying to advocate people going and being super opinionated and judgmental in our society and having opinions and telling everyone how to live their lives. That's not what you were saying on Sunday.
Oh, please no.
Yes. I just wanted to really, really spell it out.
Yeah, I think Brodie kicked this off by saying we get really uptight about all the wrong things.
Yes.
And I think we almost just need to detox from a particular agenda. I think part of it for me is that, our culture has lost the narrative even of Jesus. The kind of Christian message has become almost kind of overtaken by some of these kind of moral missiles that we kind of fire into public debate. So I certainly would be advocating for us to find a much more winsome but clear communication of what it is we actually believe. And even on the be interested to hear what Brodie has to say about this, but I just kind of think even on the justice kind of issue, I wonder if we ought to be majoring on justice issues where our message is a positive message rather than a negative message, because I think the mentality that people often perceive is that church, we're just complaining about things and we have a negative view. But I think there's lots of positive contributions that we can make. And that people are making. I think I'm jumping to the end of what I said on Sunday morning, which is that actually people are making some really positive contributions. And we need to affirm and endorse that as a community as well.
Have you got an easy example of that? What you mean by that in a positive justice way? I
think the one that stands out for me is the Make Poverty History kind of campaign, which is quite a long time ago now. But I just think that arose out of the kind of global connections that the church had and the kind of concern that we had for one another and for what the church was doing in all sorts of countries. So it kind of came out of a really grassroots awareness where the church actually globally was much more aware, I think, of the issue than many other people, and was able to talk with awareness and clarity, but also just out of a really authentic place. Please don't ask me what the current one might be in comparison with that.
I won't.
Let me just kind of leave it at that.
I was going to ask you what the negative example would be, if you're prepared to name one. What's one where you've looked back and you go, "Oh, really wish we or they or whomever hadn't done that"?
Well, I think there's. Yeah, I was just going to say probably just more a general mentality. I think, where I think particularly in this country we had the privileged position of being at the centre of culture, and I think as that has eroded, we have felt that our morality is the one that should be foisted on everybody else, and therefore we need to campaign in order to protect our own status. And I think the position of the church is not that we are in the kind of heart of a culture, but that, we speak into a culture from maybe more from the sidelines. And I think it's been difficult for us as a people to kind of come to that position.
And is that the essential difference between possibly our experience of church in the UK versus church in the United States? That we have this cultural separation that doesn't exist, so that the mixing of all of the messages and the raising of the stakes just seems so much more noise over there than there is over here, for good or ill.
Yeah, I think that's a whole other podcast, Richard. Kind of getting into that.
Coming soon to Christianity Today.
I think what links them both, Richard, is that certainly Western Christianity, so I think the global South is different, has what people would refer to as a Constantinian heritage of, so in, was it 321, Battle of Milan Bridge, Constantine paints the Greek letters Chi and Rho on his shields because of a vision that he'd had, and all of a sudden the Roman Empire becomes Christian, and it placed this marginalised, powerless, politically powerless, economically powerless, culturally marginal group at the centre of a big machine. And the question is where are we called to, or what kind of power are we called to exercise? And I think that's sometimes where we get ourselves in a bit of a fankle, a bit muddled. But wouldn't it be fantastic if people knew what the church was for, or who God was for, rather than what the church is against or who God is against? Because so many people think, do you know what, God is against me. Mm-hmm. And yet the wonderful message of Jesus is God is for you. God is for you. You know, while we were yet sinners, God loved us. So it's not that we're saying, do you know what, just stay as you are. We all need to change. I am a sinner. You know, and I think that's the message that perhaps people don't, you know, if I am to say something, I'm not saying it from a place of self-righteousness. I'm saying it from a place of self-awareness, of I am aware of the dark places in my heart that God needs to transform. But God is for me. He loves me. His mercy comes before justice with God. And therefore, you know, going back to the justice thing of how do we frame that positively, of it's talking about God's love and his mercy and his forgiveness and his desire to transform and heal, rather than some kind of like Marxist kind of like, there are two great tribes in the world and they're at war with each other. It's not a war, it's about healing and transformation and wholeness.
So Daniel was in a culture a bit like, you know, the ones that spring to mind is Moses and Joseph, whereby they spent a lot of time in a culture that was different from their Jewish culture, their culture of covenant with God. And what we see in Daniel is, what I'd be interested to know is, what do we learn from that, from Daniel's experience? Because my reading of it is that Daniel was happy to live in the culture, changed his name, changed his food, right up until the point that some sort of line was crossed. But when the line was crossed, his response wasn't pushing back over the line. It was, I guess the metaphor is in the prayer, he opens his doors. He doesn't actually go outside his doors. He just displays to the world what he is doing, which is still praying, as opposed to, here's this nasty law, I am going outside, rushing into the street, into the heart of the precinct or the heart of the court or in the king's face, and I'm going to sit down and pray in front of him. No, I'm just going to make sure that everybody knows that this is what I am doing. Does that speak to anything about how we as Christians should respond to something that we find culturally challenging in the way that Daniel responded?
I think that kind of posture, you could call it sacred resistance. I kind of like that expression, you know, where without kind of dysregulating or, you know, becoming absolutely crazy in terms of his reaction, he just simply resists and explains why he resists. But he's actually quite positively disposed. I mean, Darius in this story is actually very positive about him. Even in chapter 1, where he talks about, not eating what has been given to him. Again, he is actually quite positively disposed to those around. He says, check this out. If I'm worse off after I've eaten these vegetables, then you win. But if I'm not, then it's a win-win for all of us. So, he does actually, he resists, but he resists with a kind of very positive articulation of why he's doing that without actually becoming reactive or aggressive in his position, which I think is a really helpful way of looking at this. I think we probably do tend to, get really reactive, either get really reactive or get very passive. And I think what's really interesting with him is he does neither of those things. He resists the negativity, but he also doesn't just kind of passively embrace what the culture that he's in dictates to him.
I think as well, Ian hit on something really important in one of his 3 points on Sunday of that whole rhythm of spiritual life. So we don't know what Daniel prayed when he's going to pray 3 times a day. We know that it includes praising God. But I think in our world in which people are like, where is God? Why do all these bad things happen? For us to spend time in God's presence and be shaped and reminded of that, so that when we go out from kind of like our place, whether it's got windows or not, that we're shaped by that. So prayer in this situation, not so much as a big long list to God of all what's wrong with the surrounding culture, but a re-embedding ourselves in God's goodness and his presence with us, that God is playing the long game and not the short game, and praising him and being shaped and formed by that, I think is key within this, and allowing God of, perhaps our prayer should be, search me, what's change me, as that starting place, because it would quite easy, wouldn't it, to pray 3 times a day and go out hate-filled.
I think this, in ways of speaking about one of the things I wanted to comment on that you had mentioned earlier, Brodie, and that you talked about that capacity that we have to keep God with us outside of a Sunday situation, to be in an interaction with someone and to know in confidence that God is with us. And in many ways, I feel like there's an extraordinary confidence in Daniel about who God is to him, that he comes across in this quiet confidence that there isn't a need to be in any way, I'm going to use the word aggressive, I don't mean aggressive, but to be very, very strong in response. It's exactly that, going back to the vegetables thing in chapter 1, which if you've not read chapter 1, anybody go back and read it, where he's saying, I am so confident that God is not going to require this of me, that I will demonstrate that I will still be well and healthy. And he just seems so calm as a person. I mean, obviously, we only get what we get in terms of the scripture that's written down. So, there's not saying that he wasn't having a good pray about something in panic at some point. We don't know that. But his confidence in God and who God is, and that he didn't need to adapt to the world. He needed to know that he was living according to heaven's culture on earth. And I think that feels like the place that we're missing now, in that we're not confident of what God is calling, how God is calling us to live. We're not confident in that, almost in a way, and we're not confident in the ways that God is going to show up for us. And it's almost like we have a level of discovery of who God is still to go in order to get, or, we all have more discovery, but that there is something else to be discovered for us in who God is.
Maybe I could frame it this way, that, we are invited into a lifestyle of worship. We are made in God's image as worshippers. And this guy, I think we've referenced this guy before, Jamie Smith, or James K.A. Smith to give him his Sunday name, who's talked about what he calls secular liturgies, and basically talks of the way in which our culture invites us to worship. So to worship whatever it is that we engage in day by day, whether it's our workplace activities or leisure activities or whatever. All of that is calling out worship from us. It's calling us to love things. And that is good, but that can sometimes can supplement God as being the one over all. So I just kind of want to give a shout out today, because this kind of is a good place to kind of bring it. But for a little book called The Liturgy of the Ordinary by Trish Harrison Warren. And she basically takes a day in her life from waking up, making the bed, taking the kids to school, and a number of things. And she actually looks at how all of those things are acts of worship, and how all of those things are kind of infused with God's revelation of who he is and what he's done for us. And it's quite a quick book to read. It's quite the kind of book you can dip into. There might be some chapters that you just kind of go, she's taking things a bit far. But actually, just as a principle, that idea that every day there are invitations to worship, whether it's getting the duvet off or whether it's washing our faces, which you would relate to forgiveness and cleansing, or, eating food, which speaks of God's bounty and God's grace towards us. So things like that just integrate into the regularity of our day, the reality of God's presence. And I think sometimes we need to be intentional about that. And I think that kind of speaks to what Brodie said of having lives that are lived outside or without those recollections of God's presence, and we get eroded because we're not really intentionally seeking God's presence in the day-to-day.
It's interesting that you say that, actually, because when you use the phrase, our faith can be eroded by 1,000 compromises, and instantly the line that came to me is 1,000 Hallelujahs from the Brooke Ligertwood song that was released from her album 7, probably last year or something. And I thought, what would I rather pick, 1,000 compromises or 1,000 Hallelujahs? Because both are going to lead me to entirely different places. Just the contrast of them. Sorry, that was a digression.
I just refuse to accept that there's any worship to be had in buttoning up the duvet, but that's where I went.
Oh, and your mundane tasks? You don't think that can happen?
You need to read this. This is just the book for you, Richard.
Buttoning up the duvet is work of the devil.
So when you get lost in the duvet and can't find the edges of that, just speaks of God's bigness and his mystery and how we get lost in his love and his goodness, which is like a warm blanket around us, giving us a hug.
Bless
Brodie's
you, Brodie.
now writing children's songs for a living. My God's duvet is so big, so strong and so mighty. There's no length of body can't cover with my feet sticking out the bottom when it's cold. Whatever. We'll maybe do that one day, Brodie. We'll give you a random topic and you have to preach a 5-minute sermon on it. Sermon illustration from the most mundane things we can think of.
That would be pinching something that they do in the Holy Post.
That's true, actually. Yes. Copyright Holy Post. You spoke, Ian, about the kind of taking a minute, taking 2 minutes. I think you related how you and we've spoken in the past about how you're not a journaler, you struggle with that, and I'm like in 1,000 places at once, so I struggle as well with that sort of thing. Do you have any personal tips or revelations about what you actually do, Brodie and Ian, to kind of end up your feet on the floor at some point during the day, taking a break? It must be quite difficult being in full-time ministry, not if you like say, oh, well, that counts because I wrote a sermon or I went to visit somebody. So that counts with me spending time with God because that's what I do full-time. Give us some advice, an example.
Yeah, I'm back to Trish Harrison Warren because I just think it's a way of really outmaneuvering that whole piece whereby we kind of segregate our days into this is the God spot and this is the non-God spot. So back to the duvet. So the throwing off the duvet.
I feel a new trope coming on for the show.
No, this is what. So she says, we are marked from our first waking moment by an entity that is given to us by grace, an identity that's deeper and more real than any other identity that we will don that day. So,
Cool.
First waking moment, remind yourself that actually your identity has already been set and you live out that day from that position. So some of these things actually, I suppose my challenge is that actually reflecting on something that is small and intense in the course of the day is actually a really helpful way of embedding God's presence into the day, rather than even just kind of stocking up with lots of information, because it's about chewing something over that has real value. So sometimes just starting off with something that's profound, but you can chew on for the rest of the day is really, can be helpful for me. Just one little thing.
So a couple of things in the morning, so not necessarily first thing. I have been trying to develop the habit of just spending 2 to 5 minutes in silence, just saying, God, I choose to sit in your presence and I choose to sit in your love. Just to develop that awareness of God's presence, that God is for us, not bringing a great big long list. And as part of that, I will use some set prayers. That way I'm not kind of like bumbling off on my own agenda and again just bringing God a great big shopping list. There's lots of kind of like wee books of different set prayers. Some people like kind of like the Celtic and Northumbria community stuff. I'm using presently St. Benedict's prayer book, just because I find that rhythm quite helpful, and it's something that I perhaps wouldn't naturally go to, so it brings a slight challenge there. And then at night time, trying to get into the presence of doing what's called the examine, where you just think about what has happened during the day and give God thanks for it before you go to bed. Thank you, God, that you have been with me in the podcast. Help me with those tricky questions of just a simple prayer like that before going to bed, just developing that heart of thankfulness and also remembering, because that's the thing, that our lives can be so fast that when do we stop to actually notice what God has been doing or what's been happening? So at night time, trying to take that a few moments before I fall asleep really quite quickly when I go to bed of trying to do that before I start to snooze.
You had talked about the pivotal moments that Daniel chose not to compromise. And I think that it's fair to say there are many examples of him inquiring of God. So in these personal times that he's having, in the times of prayer, whatever he is doing, the interaction with God is one that is fueling him and sustaining him. But I noticed in chapter 2, I love the book of Daniel, total side note. You could be in that for 6 months, could you not, for sermons? Like it's pretty good. I still, as a kid, think back to the handwriting on the wall, and I think that is just terrifying and incredible as a kid's story. Totally amazing. So
Jackie, I make that about the 6th book that you love, which is great because you just love scripture, don't you?
This
you
is
just
my
love
problem.
Scripture, which is brilliant.
I do. Yes, okay, that's true. That's true. But it's also
I
Old
like
Testament.
This and I like this and I like this.
It's Old Testament. It just gets me really excited. But I think that one of his interesting points in chapter 2 is that when Nebuchadnezzar's had a dream and he doesn't know what it is, and he decides that he's suddenly, because none of the wise men will transpose it, will tell him what it's about, so he's going to get rid of them all. And Daniel goes to him and asks for more time. And I always think that's an interesting thing, because Daniel doesn't go to him saying, I already have the answer. He asks for more time from Nebuchadnezzar, and then he goes and he inquires of God. He doesn't already, we imagine that's just because Daniel had it all together and he was just getting all these supernatural insights all the time and he just knew everything. No, he was intentional about what he pursued. He was intentional about the questions that he asked. He was intentional in his relationship. And I feel that's really challenging to me, because it's too easy to think, well, God didn't tell me that, as I had my breakfast this morning as well. Did you ask? And did you have the conversation? And so much of his capacity to not compromise in situation is fueled by relationship. surely.
I think Daniel would be a great guy to give a Twitter account to, or maybe an X account.
An X account.
Yeah, because, his response is reflective and prophetic. It's not reactive. And I think actually what you brought out kind of speaks to what we've been, I think, trying to say all along, is that our engagement needs to be out of a deep and rich place, which God deposits within us, and not out of this kind of rapid fire reaction that our culture, and particularly social media, and social media is affecting our culture, that kind of promotes within us. So they'll let me go and think about this so that I can say something productive and something that has the hand of God on it. I think is probably a lesson that we need to learn. So there's another lesson from Daniel that would be really useful for those of us before you send the email, before you tweet. Pray about it.
Well, but that's so true, because he comes across like the heart of the Father. He comes across as wisdom. He comes across as kindness, fairness. In his interactions, he's always respectful. He doesn't feel like there's judgment there. Like, genuinely, this is an incredible example for modern day life.
Yeah, and I think when we set out on this series at the beginning, we were kind of thinking about what our emotional health is that undergirds our discipleship. And of course, we hadn't really dived into the story of Daniel when you set out, but I was just really struck as I was reflecting on it last week of how much his life integrates all the things that we've been talking about and kind of demonstrates what spiritual maturity, emotional maturity, relational maturity, all of that package looks like. And it actually looks like something that is distinctive. It's not driven by culture. It's not threatened by intimidation. But it actually brings direction and real wisdom to the world. It's a lasting wisdom that leaves a legacy, but also exalts God. And who wouldn't want to be Daniel? This is the product of a life that's well lived in God.
So, Richard, you had trailed at the beginning of this episode before even you realised you didn't actually allow Brodie to say good morning or hello or anything because you were so busy going on a lion's trail. Brodie, you started off talking to us this morning by saying that you've been attacked by a lion.
Yes. No, that's telling the story big.
This better not turn out to be like a cuddly toy being thrown at you from across a room or something. This better be a real teeth and claws lion.
It was a lion cub.
It's a little lion.
So once upon a time in Belfast Zoo, you could go into a cage with the lion cubs.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me stop you right there. I'm thinking you're in some safari somewhere, being attacked by a lion. You're in Belfast Zoo being attacked by a lion cub. Okay, just to make sure that's clear.
Yeah. I mean, it was the size probably of an Alsatian or something like that. Anyway, I was petting one of the lions and one of them jumped on my back and started to ragdoll me. And so that's my story of being attacked by a lion.
That's still fairly terrifying.
Where there's blame, there's a claim.
I reread the Lion's Den story before we came on today, and I still am just stunned. I'm also stunned by the part of it that ends up with everyone else being thrown into the lion's den, including the wives and the children, which again is one of these, oh my goodness, the Bible can just be sometimes. Sorry, not everyone can see my face when I'm doing that. I'm just realising that was a face for television, not radio. But gosh, that's just, imagine all night with a lion, doesn't touch you. What's the story that's going on there? What's going on in his head? What's the interaction with him and the lion? Do they end up talking? Is it one of these? I mean, it just blows my brain. No one else has these thoughts, only me.
Yeah, but no one has any answers.
It's just, don't we have these wonderings about Daniel, though? I just have all these wonderings. What actually happened? Okay,
so while everyone is pondering the mysteries of what Daniel did through the night with a lion, was it like a tea party, or do they sit opposite sides like a high school dance at opposite sides of the cage, or did they cuddle on down because it was a comfy place to rest your head? I have no idea.
Richard, you have tea parties with tigers, not lions.
Not
get your children's books right.
Well done.
Okay, so there's no bear hunts involved, right? That's fine, or hungry caterpillars. Okay, so we're coming to the end, but I just want to touch on where you ended, Ian, which I suppose is kind of the opposite, kind of the tension to the initial kind of not being all domineering and outspoken for no good reason, but that was the idea of, play it a bit dangerously, don't play it safe. Talk us through how that side of the coin relates to the previous side of the coin, if you like.
Yeah, well, I think if I get you right, Richard, as I was preparing this, it just really struck me that so many people that I know are actually strategically located. Mm-hmm. So, people in our society are looking to be influencers, but actually people are already influencers. They're being looked at, they're being observed, they're being listened to. And people have an opportunity to contribute where they are. Now, that might just be that within a family setting, they have the opportunity to be distinctive and to set the tone. And that might just be not joining in with something. It might be refusing to agree with gossip, or not coming into agreement with criticism of some kind. It could be standing with somebody who has been marginalized in a family or a workplace. Those kind of things, we have the opportunity to do that. And that often takes a little bit of sticking your head above the parapet and saying, I'm going to make this contribution. So I think that was in my mind, that actually we're already, all of us, I think, strategically located. God has put us somewhere. It might not be Babylon, but it will certainly be somewhere where we can have an influence and an impact. And I think the other thing with that was actually, and I really don't want to highlight people above and beyond others, because I think that opportunity for impact is right across the board. But when I think of some of the people within our fellowship, and you get to know people and you realize what they do during the week, or you realize where God has located them, and you think this is a really challenging, but also a really significant opportunity that you've been given. And we've reflected in the past about what we've called front lines at those places within our lives, whether it's work or leisure or family and community, where we have been placed. And we spend a lot of time in those locations, and we have opportunity to make a significant difference, and to try and see that God has placed us and God is present with us, and God can use us in those environments. I think it's just important, because often we maybe try and drag people out of those places and say, well, be a witness for Jesus here, when actually Jesus already put you there to be a witness.
That reminds me of a quote that, so Paul Manwaring, he used to be based in Bethel, and I think he's based in somewhere down south now, because he's from England. So I think he just went home. He has a phrase, he wastes nothing and he gets you ready. And it's that sense that everywhere, every part of your life is not for nothing. There is always something that can be in that moment, in that place, in the mundane everything, in the putting on the washing. It's all part of, it's this not compartmentalizing our lives, isn't it? It's that our life is our life, and everything within it is all part of and one thing. All of it surrendered to him, all the mundane parts, including the duvet cover too.
I'm sorry, I still refuse to accept the duvet cover.
Okay, we'll work on you.
We'll work on that. Work in progress. Good stuff. Well, that seems like an opportune point to bring our show to a conclusion. So one final word, Brodie?
I think my encouragement to people would be develop, doesn't matter what time or part of the day it is, but develop that rhythm of just sitting in God's presence. Find a quiet spot. Could do as John Wesley's mum did and put your apron over your head if necessary to Mark, that this is your quiet time of just building up that sense that God is with us, God is active, and take that out into where God has placed you.
Jackie?
I'm feeling really challenged to read all of Daniel again, but that's not a surprise. This is like what happened with Ruth. Brody's just going to be laughing at me at this point. I feel like there's so much here about remembering that whether you're in the lion's den or whether you feel like you're in the fire, you know, it's that whole thing of I won't be burned. God's plans for me can't be thwarted by the things that are going on around about me. Just that challenge to be braver.
Ian, you preached it. You get the final word?
Yeah, I suppose it's something like turning the risk dial up just a little bit. What would be a kind of bigger risk for you to get engaged with this week? And so I think that means that I get to finish with my quotation.
Yes.
As well, from the wonderful Neil Anderson. And I don't know how many times I've said this, but I think it bears repeating, because he says risks must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, is nothing. He may avoid suffering and sorrow, but he cannot learn, feel, change, grow, love, or live. What a privilege for us to be able to walk by faith in God himself, armed with all the promises of his word. I suppose we all desire the security of the solid tree trunk, but the fruit is out on the limb. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. The timid soul asks, what do I stand to lose if I do this? The fruit-bearing Christian asks, what do I stand to lose if I don't do it? Real life is lived on the cutting edge.
That's so good.
And so if you identify something this week that you take a bit more of a risk in and you're prepared to share it, then do get in touch with the show, office@qpbc.org. Other than that, have a great week. We look forward to we're not quite starting the new series yet. We have a Vision Sunday this weekend, and then we're into our new season on the Book of Revelation, which should be fun. So looking forward to that. Have a great week, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.